The United States Land Syndicate scandal rocked the very foundations of the Appalachian Mountains. The scheme to sell fraudulent land deeds gave rise to a possible motive as to Attorney James B Marcum, Dr. Cox, and Town Marshall James Cockrill's murders. Also, this syndicate may have been a huge part of why there was feuding going on in the Appalachian Mountains. The mountains suddenly became worth a whole lot of money, and greedy men were about to cash in on it. Come along with us as we walk through the multi-state scandal that rocked the Appalachian Mountains. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. Please do not attempt to remove the safety bar while the ride is in motion. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Land for sale. For all of those who have also been keeping up with the readings of the Mountain Eagle that we have been documenting, there were a whole bunch of U.S. Marshal sales, coal land sales, and land agent companies, with advertisements for different construction companies that were coming into the area of the Appalachian Mountains. With these companies came scoundrels that saw a way to make money quick. It was not unheard of at that time for land to be sold under nefarious circumstances. Land agents would go door to door offering pennies on the dollar for mineral rights on the property that someone owned. During this time, illiteracy was at an all-time high in the mountains. Many towns had schools that went only to the 8th grade in many rural communities. A lot of people did not know how to read or write their own names on a piece of paper. What the land agents would do is to get people to sign a blank piece of paper under a false pretense and then copy the signatures on a deed and or write a bill of sale for the property on the piece of paper. A lot of people were killed if they refused to sign the paper or if they refused to sell the mineral rights to their property. But this would not be the only scam for land scandal in the mountains. One of the more shocking is the one that has been buried by the newspapers. We have to wonder if this had to do more with embarrassment by the coal companies that was purchasing the said fraudulent land, that even though the people doing the schemes were never really brought to justice, they were nonetheless vilified by the people in their areas. Even the history of some of the land agents and their enforcers have been airbrushed over time to seem more saintly towards those that opposed them than they actually were. These agents often hired the law enforcement of the area to act on their behalf to remove residents from their own lands so that the coal companies could occupy it. That is why one particular land agent is often called a sinner or a saint, depending upon which side you were on concerning the land. Scandal in the mountains. The whole scheme of selling non-existent land was exposed by a postal investigation into mail fraud. Evidently, a post office in Chicago, Illinois, became suspicious when there was a whole lot of mail correspondence coming from the United States Land Syndicate and different places in the southern United States. We get a glimpse of how the scheme was discovered and took place. It had to do with land in the South and a law that was on the books in 1785. According to the article that appears in the Paducah Sun, dated March 27, 1903. Quote, frauds unearthed. Post Office Department ferrets out a big Southern swindle. Chicago, March 27th. A new get-rich-quick scheme has been unearthed by post office officials, which promises to lay bare numerous cases where innocent people have been deprived of hard-earned savings. Alluring advertisements sent through the mails have proved to be the undoing of the parties concerned. The United States Land Syndicate, with offices at 167 Washington Street, is the firm which the post office authorities assert that has been swindling thousands of unsuspecting people by selling land located nearly every state in the South. The scheme found its origin in a law passed in 1785, which gave to settlers 1,000 acres in the best agricultural country of the South. In 1794, this law was repealed, but many persons had already obtained titles to large tracts. The law which repealed the statute passed in 1785 invalidated all titles held by the settlers. It is such invalid titles that the United States Land Syndicate has been acquiring. When a prospective purchaser of the land presented himself at the offices of the company, these titles, it is charged, were exhibited, and to be secured a better hold on the would-be buyer, a retaining fee of $5 or $10 was asked to pay for the recording of the deed and abstract titles. Thus far, two men, Lewis Enright and A.T. Denser, who were supposed to be the heads of the United States Land Syndicate, have been arrested and held to the federal grand jury under $1,500 bonds, unquote. As far as we can find, and more may come out about this as time passes, Lewis Enright and A.T. Denser were the only two men that were charged with the federal crime of fraud concerning this scandal. The crime involved the states of Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. This land was sold with the promise that the person who bought the tract of land could occupy the land as it was unclaimed and could be occupied without a grant given by the United States Land Syndicate. Officials in Breathitt, Lee, and Wolfe counties caught in land fraud. We have actually heard of the United States Land Syndicate and Jesse Spicer before. Evidently, Spicer had some involvement with Richard Brose, Potter, and Mayo of eastern Kentucky. We have evidence where he was involved in some counties, but came across no direct evidence that he was involved in Letcher County. However, we do find it interesting that during this time period, that the counties that he had business in were feuding. More evidence of fraudulent land was being revealed, as well as the get-rich-quick scheme was unfolding. The arms of the law was now starting to extend to the counties of eastern Kentucky. According to the article that appears in the Hopkinsville Kentuckian, dated August 7, 1903, quote, "Huge fraud alleged. Great swindle in Kentucky mountain lands revealed." Lexington, Kentucky, August 4th. A fraud order against the United States Land Syndicate Company, issued in Washington, is said to reveal a gigantic land swindles in Breathitt, Wolfe, and Lee counties, Kentucky. The company has been disposing of lands to which it had no title and charging recording fees and alleged back taxes, unquote. Was it the company itself that was charging these back taxes and recording fees, or was it the corrupt men that were over the county that was charging these fees? While we could not find where these men on the smaller end of this scheme ever faced charges of fraud, it is interesting that a lot of people got rich from this and suddenly disappeared from the area once it all came out and was exposed. Details of the scheme. It took 9 months for all of the details and the full scope of the scheme to be exposed. Not only were these men selling land that did not belong to them, but they were also selling imaginary land that never existed. We are pretty sure that there were several people who were very surprised to find out that they no longer owned their own land, that it had already been sold using the 1785 law that had already been taken off of the books. And not only was this land sold, but evidently there were fake back taxes owed on said property. According to the article that appears in the Mount Sterling Advocate dated December 30th, 1903, quote, "Swindled by worthless deeds to land in Breathitt. The United States Land Syndicate catches victims by the hundreds. 2 county officials of Breathitt disappear and may be implicated." A few months ago, E. L. Nobel, Deputy County Clerk, and J. E. Spicer, Deputy Sheriff, left Jackson suddenly and without notice to their friends while they were leaving. There were faint rumors to the effect that both men were seen in New York and that they were in Europe. Nothing definite has been heard of them. It came to the ears of the public about this time that a gigantic land swindle was being operated by persons in Chicago calling themselves the United States Land Syndicate, and having associates in Breathitt County who were now supposed by some to have been Deputy Clerk E. L. Noble and Deputy Sheriff J. E. Spicer. Tracts sold for $5. The Chicago people had bought for a nominal sum the open title to a large boundary of land. The title was the patent granted to James Reynolds in 1786 by the Commonwealth of Virginia. After a series of transfers, the title came into the possession of A. Coburn, trustee for the Syndicate, after the land had been occupied as homesteads by farmers for 50 to 100 years. Under patents from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the Syndicate made deeds to 61.5 acres of land to each of their vendees for the small sum of $5. On each of these deeds was printed a statement that it must be sent to E.L. Nobel, deputy clerk, with $2.25 to pay for its being recorded. This is 50 cents more than the statutory clerk's fee. It is not certainly known whether Nobel had an arrangement with the Chicago people, but it is known that when the people who thought that they were buying mountain land and not simple paper wrote to Nobel, instead of giving them the information they so much needed, he wrote letters giving encouraging reports of the land and its value, and said nothing of the worthlessness of the title of the land. Mr. Spicer was given as a reference by the syndicate, and it was supposed that he made some misleading statements to the inquirers. Part of the deal. It seems to have been part of the deal for Spicer to write to the purchasers, stating that there was a certain amount of back taxes due, and thus collecting a great deal of money. Two brothers in Chicago named Kelly bought two of the A. Coburn deeds and were preparing to set out for the mountains of Kentucky, when it occurred to their father that perhaps the deal was not right, and he at once wrote to Pollard and Rudwine, attorneys at Jackson, asking for their advice. The lawyers, after investigating the matter, advised Kelly that the titles his sons had purchased were worthless and that his sons had been swindled. A short time after that, number of lawyers, surveyors, and businessmen interested in the United States Land Syndicate were arrested by the postal authorities in Chicago for a fraudulent use of the mails. None of the money paid by the victims for taxes was turned in to the sheriff, and there is, of course, no record in the sheriff's office of these payments. It seems, also, that in most cases, the purchaser was advised that it would be well to have the tract resurveyed in order to verify the boundary, and many of them did so. In this way, many of the men who were foolish enough to buy these worthless deeds without investigation was caught not only for the price of the mythical land, but for a clerk's fee and for taxes, and in some cases for a surveyor's fee. The deeds are, of course, absolutely worthless. Letter from a victim. The Lexington Herald gives the following letter from one of the victims of the Breathitt County land frauds. July 29, 1903. The Morning Herald, Lexington, Kentucky. Dear Sirs, you should have stated your object in making the inquiry about A. Coburn, etc., etc. However, I take it for granted that it is correct to answer you. I purchased altogether 1,280 acres of land of the U.S. Land Syndicate, 500 acres of which are claimed to be located in the James Reynolds Land Grant in Breathitt County, Kentucky, 250 acres in some grant in Wolfe County, Kentucky. I paid a tax for last year of $25.50 on the Breathitt County land and was assured by Deputy Clerk E.L. Nobel and Deputy Sheriff J.E. Spicer that the land was valuable and that the title was good. I hold their letters. I paid Mr. G.W. Noble $9 to survey this land. He assured me that he had a number of surveys for recent purchasers and that they were all well pleased, and assured me that he could sell the land for a good price as soon as it was surveyed, and named coal companies who stood ready to buy as fast as the surveys were made, and he added, quote, "In fact, I will buy it myself," unquote. The United States Land Syndicate seems to have a good title to the land, and they furnish me an abstract title. That is, a complete chain back to the government. Lewis Enright, 2281 West Monroe Street, Chicago, is one of the men concerned in the syndicate. He writes that ex-senator and ex-secretary of Treasury Guthrie, Kentucky, says our titles are all right. He also claims that the courts that recently gave them a hearing decided that all the Breathitt County, Kentucky, and French's County, Tennessee land to which they lay claims were held in good title, and that the deeds given to such lands by said parties were legal deeds. The Merchants Bank, Northeast Corner, LaSalle, and Lake Street, Chicago, also wrote me that the courts decided that the titles to above-named lands to be valid. Yes, I hold the receipts for the tax in Breathitt County, Kentucky for $25.50 and in Wolfe County, Kentucky for $7.13. Also a receipt from G.W. Nobel for $9. His charges for making the Breathitt County survey, which he has never made. Unquote. Considering that the living wage of that time was around 10 to 15 cents an hour, this was an enormous price to be paid for this land. Now we have the scheme that was taking place at the time of the bloody Breathitt County feuds. We feel that the idea of this land being sold was not only to individuals, but also to coal and oil companies for the purposes of mining the area. This was at a time that the steel mills of Pennsylvania was starting to work in full swing. The Industrial Revolution of the Americas was starting to take off, and coal was needed as its fuel. How Spicer and Nobel got overlooked. Let's take a step back and look at the turmoil that was going on in Breathitt County at that time. There were several criminal trials going on at the same time in several counties over the same murders. Then there was a huge civil case that was being fought in Clark County. But up to this point, even though the names of Nobel and Spicer came up a couple of times in these court proceedings, they were nowhere to be found, and they did not send an affidavit for their testimony. So, where were they? We were not the only ones to ask this very question, according to the article that appears in the Mount Sterling Advocate, dated December 30th, 1903. Quote, Lish Nobel returns. Jackson was treated to a sensation last week by the sudden arrival of former Deputy Clerk E.L. Nobel, who left there a few days after Marcum assassination in the company of Deputy Sheriff Jesse Spicer. The mysterious disappearance of these two young men, following upon the arrest of Curtis Jett, gave rise to the report that they were in some way connected with the Marcum murder. But it soon developed that they were alleged to be implicated in the land scheme operated by Chicago sharpers under the name of the United States Land Syndicate. And upon being notified of the plight of their Chicago associates, they disappeared. Noble was said to have been an eyewitness to the killing of Marcum, and Jett filed a lengthy affidavit for continuance on account of Noble's absence, alleging that Noble would state that Jett was on the sidewalk at the time Marcum was shot, unquote. So it appears that both men went on the run immediately after the murder of Marcum. But why? Did it have to do with Marcum's murder, or was it something else? Both men were heavily implicated in the land fraud scheme that got busted in Chicago. As we have previously stated, the United States Land Syndicate had two men arrested for fraud and were facing federal charges. So it would stand to reason while all this was going down in Washington, D.C., that Noble and Spicer would not want to be found and face potential charges of fraud on their own. Spicer's mysterious train ride. But just a year later, we find something curious. While the newspaper did not state why Jesse Spicer had to go to Frankfort, it is very interesting that he was in the company of a sheriff, a judge, and several prisoners. Was he being charged with fraud or possibly the murders at this point? And what business did he have in Frankfort? According to the article that appears in the Breathitt County News, dated April 29, 1904, quote, Sheriff James P. Sizemore in company of County Judge William Robinson and Jesse Spicer left on the L&A train on Wednesday morning for Frankfort with the following prisoners sentenced to the penitentiary, unquote. You would think that he would travel on his own accord without the company of these people if he was a free person. Also, if he was working in an official capacity as deputy sheriff, the newspapers would state that fact. But instead, we see him listed as only Jesse Spicer. So, this just adds to the mystery of what he was doing in Frankfort, Kentucky. The bigger picture. The newspaper articles about Jesse Spicer skips ahead about 3 years. We get more of a complete picture of when Spicer skipped town. We also see that he did not leave without having funds. The article also gives more of a complete picture of what Spicer's role was in the scam. According to the article that appears in the Breathitt County News dated May 31st, 1907, quote, Eagle Eye of the Law. Overlooked Jesse Spicer, accused of murder. Big Pistol, Jesse Spicer, is probably the only man in the United States under indictment for 3 murders, for whom no reward has ever been offered, and who is a fugitive from justice, with no one looking for him. When the United States militia, under the orders of the governor, swept down on Jackson in Breathitt County and stopped a series of assassinations, Jesse Spicer quickly packed his trunk and slipped away. In the excitement, he was not missed. It is charged that he carried away with him many thousands of dollars. Detectives employed by Northern Investors report that for several years, Spicer was the leader of a band of men who had been receiving money from all parts of the United States, advertising extensively and selling claims to Breathitt and Perry County timberland, to which they gave titles. The deeds were executed and recorded, but the described property was afterward reported fictitious. Spicer had been closely connected with the Hargises during the reign of assassination. He has been indicted in both Breathitt and Fayette counties for the murders of Dr. Cox, James Cockrill, and James B Marcum. When last heard of, Spicer was in San Francisco, and it is said that he perished in the earthquake which destroyed the city last year. Unquote. Okay, we will find out during the trials that took place as late as 1909 that Spicer did not die in the San Francisco earthquake. He will face trial alongside of the Hargises and others. However, we will state that we could not find any historical records concerning Jesse Spicer or what happened to him after those events. Also, according to this article, we now have a connection between the feuds going on in Perry and Breathitt counties. It seems that B.F. French was not the only connection between the two. But we do find it odd that the murders of Cockrill and Cox would be tried in Fayette County, as the men did not die, nor was the crime of murder committed in that county. Questions we are asking in the upcoming trial. This actually leaves us with more questions than answers. Why would Spicer and Nobel wait until after the murder of Marcum to leave town if the whole land scandal was exposed a couple of months before that point? After all, James Marcum would die on May 4th, 1903, and the United States Land Syndicate scandal would hit the newspapers on March 27th, 1903. So, why wait if the men thought that they could be arrested at any time by federal agents? Conversely, why leave if Marcum was the reason that the men thought that they would be caught? Did Spicer and Noble direct the Hargis and French factions about how to handle those that opposed what they were doing? How in the world would someone that was accused of land and mail fraud be connected to a string of murders in Breathitt County? And why not also in Perry County? And furthermore, why would Spicer be indicted for the murders and yet he would not be arrested or even hunted down to face the charges? Were Spicer and Noble the actual linchpins that connected everyone together and gave the reason behind the murders? Were these murders committed because Cox, Cockrill, and Marcum came close to exposing the scandal in Breathitt and Perry counties that would implicate the Hargises and French factions? And if so, how many of the murders in Perry County were actually connected to this scandal? When the news about the United States Land Syndicate hit the newspapers, was this the connection that Marcum needed to piece everything together that was going on in both counties? Was this the reason behind Marcum going to the courthouse to file paperwork concerning the deeds, and also the reason why there were several lawsuits that Marcum would be part of that implicated Sheriff Callahan? Could this have been what was written in the newspapers about Kentucky State Senator Alex Hargis, and he wanted a public apology because it implicated him in this scandal? Will any of these questions finally be answered in the trial, or will they be covered up? And why, before now, wasn't any of this handed down to future generations about what was really going on during this time? Why the cover-up for 100 years? We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the scandals of the Consolidation Coal Company. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. Please double check that you are subscribed, as many of our viewers are finding that they are no longer subscribed to our channel. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.